Welcome back to Season 2 of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast, where we look forward to the new synthesis in the new millennium between faith, philosophy, and science.
Welcome back to That's So Second Millennium. We are really privileged to have Jonathan Lunine on the podcast again. So we're hoping to, in this interview, talk about both a little bit more of a deep cut into his experience as a scientist, and hopefully talk a little bit about his experience with other scientists of faith. And then we will hope to transition in a second episode to talking a little bit more about his specialty of planetary science, which we would love to cover in a little bit more depth and see if we can a little bit of the interface between planetary science and giving a perspective of faith on that, perspective of faith and creation. I am a little bit under the weather, so I'm going to be depending on Bill, especially in this early part, to get this going.
Well, let me join my voice in thanking Dr. Lunine for his participation again. And Dr. Lunine, when we talked in the podcast episode that was posted in August, we discussed, both the planetary science involvement and an important aspect of your life, the faith journey, how life took you from your roots in an observant Jewish family to becoming Catholic was it 2007 that you joined the church?
Yes, I made the decision in 2006. And I started the RCIA process in the fall of 2006 and was baptized and confirmed on Holy Saturday in 2007.
Beautiful.
That's wonderful.
And yes, and you had said at that time that your journey was certainly not taken alone as an individual, but very much in community, both in the religious sense, but also among the scientific community. And you had found in conversation with other scientists a certain valuable affirmation that your combination of religion and science, they were both harmonious and both a fruitful part of your background, and you gained encouragement from people that you met and dealt with, because that's so important in so many people's journey. We were wondering if you'd talk about maybe one or two of the folks who played an important role for that journey.
Sure. Well, certainly from the personal side, when I made the decision to begin the RCIA process, I actually called a personal friend who also was our son's pediatrician, Bill Madden, and he was, of course, not only very encouraging, but immediately began sending me books to read, which was great. And he was a huge support. My wife, although she's not a Catholic, was very supportive as well. On the science side, what really made an impression on me was the way that the astronomers of the Vatican Observatory live their lives. These are all Jesuit brothers or priests, and some of them I had known. One of them I had known even before he made a decision to become a Jesuit back in I knew him since 1981. It was not till the mid-'80s that he decided to do that, but I knew him in, I guess it was 1982 was I first met him. That was Guy Consolmagno. And some of the others I had met at when I joined the University of Arizona, principally in 1988. So really it goes way back. And I think given where I was at the time, it wasn't so much that I was impressed by their harmonious melding of science and faith. It was almost in some ways a curiosity to me. And I have to say that when I first realized that Guy was becoming a Jesuit was when he showed up at a scientific conference with a name badge that said Guy Consolmagno, SJ. And I said, what's that? But it was later in my life as I began to learn more about the Catholic faith that I also began to realize that this was something that was very special to the Jesuit astronomers. The way that they really seamlessly were able to hold their science and their faith as individuals who, for which this was not an internal battle, at least not one that you could see from the outside, but seemed to be very natural. That these were things that fitted together very, very well, and that was impressive to me.
Yeah, and so that was an early affirmation. And as you were going through the RCIA process, and then preparing for actual baptism and entry, did it become a matter of conversation with others in the scientific community? And did you find some affirmation there too?
I think not so much during that period. It was a funny thing. I did the RCIA process at the campus Newman Center, which was literally just a block away from the space science complex on campus, where we had astronomy on one side. We had my building, the Lunar and Planetary Lab, to the west of that, and then sort of on the north side, completing a little square there, was the headquarters of the National Optical Astronomy Observatories. And then just on the other side of that, to the north of that, was the Newman Center, which was run by the Dominicans. So I didn't have a lot of contact with scientists who were Catholic at that time, but after my baptism and when I began going to Mass, I actually began to notice that there were astronomers who I had known who were at the Mass as well. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that he or she was Catholic. And over time, that network, I guess I would say, of colleagues who also were Catholic grew. It grew over time.
That's great. And so there were not only the pleasant surprises that these people shared this with you, but did you wind up having discussions with them that shed light on and reinforced the idea that one could see this harmonious compatibility between faith and science?
I think in the early years after my baptism, most of that kind of discussion came through a very nice series that was organized by Father Bill Steger, who was one of the Vatican astronomers and a Jesuit priest. He died maybe 5 years ago now. And he organized something called the St. Albert the Great Forum of Science and Faith about once a month, and there would be a speaker on these topics. And so that was really an opportunity to have those kinds of discussions. My friends over in the Vatican Observatory, of course, I have to give you a little geography. Their main headquarters, as we all know, is in southeast of Rome. It used to be in Castel Gandolfo. Now technically it's in Albano on the other side of the Papal Gardens. That's their main headquarters, but they also have a house and also offices in Tucson. The offices are in the astronomy building at the University of Arizona, and that's because they have a telescope facility on one of the mountains east of Tucson. So, they were there, but, all honesty, with the exception of Bill Steger himself and Father George Coyne, there wasn't a lot of participation from them in that activity. We had also had a Templeton funded project that was going on between religious studies and astronomy at the U of A. That was very stimulating. But it wasn't, I think, until I moved to Ithaca, to Cornell in 2011, that a lot of these discussions really, I think, happened. I mean, even though I spent quite a bit of time with the Jesuit astronomers in 2009 when I did a 2-year leave of absence in Rome. And actually, until my wife and son came out, they provided me with an apartment. We didn't get into many deep discussions. And I think the reason for that is that, really because their lives of science and faith were so much something that they lived every day. It was very natural. There wasn't this need to have a kind of a discussion of how that worked, if you want to think of it that way. One of those astronomers, Gabriele Giunti, became my spiritual advisor during that time. But, for the others, they did their work. They lived out their lives of faith, and there wasn't a lot of need to talk about it. It was when I got to Cornell and began to not only talk with some people here, but also having met Stephen Barr in 2015, I guess, was 2014. And we began putting together the society. That's when the conversations really became intense.
And those might have been conversations not so much with Ithaca Cornell colleagues, but with colleagues literally around the country as the membership of the Society of Catholic Scientists grew.
Yes, and people that I had interacted with scientifically who I had not realized were Catholic and who ended up joining us in putting this society together, that was a very pleasant surprise as well. And Karin Oberg, for example, who's an astronomer at Harvard. So it was I would call it a gradual pathway to discovery. And it was something that kind of arose very naturally and over the years, and has been, I think, very, very much a joyful experience for me to be able to see this network grow.
Really? Yeah. Mm-hmm. The stereotype for many people would be that your pathway would also lead you to conversations with some colleagues that could almost have become hurdles to a growing religiosity, simply because there might have been resistance among some scientists to either talking about religion or even resistance to religion itself. But how did you experience that mix?
Right. So that's certainly there. Now, of course, as Catholics, we all know we're very good at the guilt thing. And I always felt this sense of guilt about this, that, I had come to this decision late in my life after I had, gotten tenure and been promoted to full professor, had a reputation in the field. I keep thinking about young people who want to be able to, live out their faith more visibly, but are near the beginning of their careers where they're being judged by more senior colleagues, where they will have to go through the tenure process or even get hired to be a faculty member.
Yeah.
It's not so easy, even though it's, of course, illegal to make decisions on employment based on one's religion. We all know very well that as human beings, we tend to have our biases. And so in many ways, I think I had it easy. But nonetheless, for the first few years after I became Catholic, I did keep a lot of this to myself. And, I went quietly to Mass. And it was not really until I was in this leave of absence in Rome that I really felt it was time to come out, and if you will. And then at Cornell, I think if you want to call it a coming out party at some level, it was giving a talk on Lemaitre in front actually in the Space Sciences building. My associate director here, who's also Catholic, said, well, we should have this talk in the Space Science building. It was part of a series that we were organizing here. And so because it was in the Space Science building, a lot of my colleagues showed up who might not otherwise show up. And so to me, that was a kind of a crossroad, I would say, where a watershed moment where, basically I spoke in terms of my faith, and not only about Lemaitre, but also about myself. And really, that was, if you think about it, it was almost a decade after I'd become a Catholic. I gave many talks. I'd given talks at other places, and really the first of those was the Dallas Ministry Conference, where I talked in 2010. But those were all people from other institutions, some higher education, some high school. To do this in your home institution, I think, was really crossing a threshold, and that was very important for me.
Wow.
Yeah. Publicly owning it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you're reminding me of the line from Scripture where Jesus said a prophet is respected everywhere except in his hometown.
Yes, and the thought actually did come to me as to whether I would be hustled out of the building and brought to the cliff. That Cornell does overlook the town, and there's quite a drop there.
Right?
But that
right.
Thankfully didn't happen. So
no. We're not to that point yet.
Right. Yeah. Without hyperbolizing it too much for the sake of humor, there, I'm just basically wondering how severe that risk would have been in terms of actually causing personal rifts with a number of colleagues. It does that kind of thing happen? My expectation is that it might happen a bit less in the field of astronomy and planetary science than in perhaps some other scientific fields, simply because astronomy is all about the mysteries of the cosmos and all of that. Was there at least that hope that rifts could be avoided?
Yeah, that's correct. Astronomy, the study of astronomy actually carries with it a certain amount of humility. And many astronomers, of course, also entered the field with backgrounds in physics and quantum mechanics, as a colleague once said to me, was kind of physics comeuppance a century ago, where it became clear that physics was not going to be able to deterministically predict everything that would happen for all time. Quantum mechanics put an end to that. And I think that both the grandeur of the cosmos and the puzzles that we have now with quantum physics really do impart a certain humility. Now, having said that, there are plenty of colleagues, of course, who are atheist and proud of it, and will make some very dogmatic statements about the lack of existence of God and so forth. Stephen Hawking is a famous example of that. But I think you see more tolerance of this in astronomy. And I also believe that the greater age of astronomy is an intellectual endeavor, and the fact that it really has come of age very slowly, including during a time when many religious people, all the way from Copernicus to Galileo to Georges Lemaitre, made substantial contributions to astronomy. That also has, I think, given the field a certain cultural flavor that's more flexible in terms of the question of science and faith, compared, for example, to biology and especially neurobiology. Those are fields where people who believe in God have a much tougher time socially and in terms of their interactions with their colleagues. No question about it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Biology.
And was one of the avenues of opening up conversation these particular talks about particular astronomers like Lemaitre? So long as you kept the conversations to specific people and specific accomplishments in the field, was that the best portal into conversations about faith and religion? It might be, if so, it could be a kind of helpful tip to younger scientists who are wanting to integrate the two, but they fear the more general and more catechetical kinds of conversations. They keep it to the science.
I gave the convocation address a week ago, Friday, to at Ave Maria University. And one of the things that I said, which is private Catholic university in Florida, near Naples, one of the things I did point out is that one should not hide one's faith, but one should be judicious about how one essentially talks about it. And of course, one size doesn't fit all. And so, yes, I think one has to discern what is the right way to talk about one's faith. Obviously, you wouldn't go into a faculty meeting and try to evangelize everybody as if you were, Paul or something like that. On the other hand, Paul himself adapted his messages to the crowd that he was in front of. And, in particular, what impressed me very much is Paul's experience in Athens, as reported in Acts of the Apostles, where, he finds himself in front of, on the Areopagus, Mars Hill, if you will, in front of a group of Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. And his message is really tuned to what they might be able to understand. The concept of God as the creator of the universe, the concept of God as being in and of itself. And these are things that you don't see in a lot of other places in the letters of Paul. It's very particular in that speech that he gave to those philosophers. And of course, when he got to the resurrection, that was too much for them. And, that was the end of the speech. But he did convert some people that day. And then he went on to Corinth. And in Corinth, his message was much more, I would say, direct and kind of not philosophical. It was a message in the synagogue to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. So Paul himself really tuned his messages to his audience at some level. And we get glimpses of that in both Acts and in the epistles. And I think that that's a good lesson for the rest of us. There's a book. It's one of actually a series. It's the third of 3 books by some sociologists, I think, and statisticians. I think Elaine Eklund is the first author. They're published by Oxford, and it's an analysis of how scientists and religious people regard religious belief and the science and faith controversy. And the third book is about how this is regarded in different parts of the world. And it's an interesting book, but I raise it because toward the end of it, they make the point that in the U.S., which is actually where that conflict is most evident and most bitter, that they have found that where colleagues who are believers are willing to open up a little bit and expose their beliefs to their colleagues, to share in an appropriate way that their colleagues can, don't feel uncomfortable, that actually diminishes significantly the level of perceived tension and incompatibility between science and faith, that you can win over your colleagues who are not religious by being open enough about your faith that they can, if you will, there's something they can consume there without feeling like they're being evangelized in some way. And of course it takes experience, and sometimes you miss, but it's, I think, it's essentially the happy medium between being completely closed about these things and being very evangelical about them. And so, being judicious in how you approach your colleagues can really change this. And I've had that experience. I had that experience with well-known evolutionary biologist, actually, who was very anti-Christian because he felt he had been beaten up by evangelicals on the subject of evolution. And we were together for a 2-day Library of Congress discussion called Astrobiology and the Sacred. And it was during those discussions that I really saw him soften up about this. Of course, I didn't convert him to Christianity, but he gained an understanding of the breadth of the faith that went beyond the sort of narrow, aggressive window that he felt he had been subjected to. And so it's very important for scientists to do this. And I told that to the students at Ave Maria. I said, be judicious and thoughtful in how you do it. But by all means, share your faith with your colleagues so that they understand what that faith really means and what it has done for you in your lives.
Does that difficulty that has to be overcome, does that even extend to fellow scientists who identify fairly strongly and immediately as atheists? Is it almost does the term atheist almost become kind of an easy label for shutting down conversation? Might even that term mask a certain level of openness to religious discussions if it's approached at the right point of conversation, or because I've often wondered in some people's minds, what does it mean to be an atheist? Is it considered to be a professional requirement by them? Is it very visceral because of something that happened in their own lives, and is trying to decide the nature of their atheism a big part of your very good strategy, as it were, for finding common ground? I just find that term atheism has a lot of different shades of meaning itself.
Right. I mean, it's a term that has a lot of emotional content to it, and it can be used as a weapon, and of course people then shut down. So one really needs to be very careful about how one uses it. I think that most of my colleagues would not necessarily call themselves atheists. Those who are not believers might say, well, I'm perhaps agnostic or maybe leaning toward not believing in God. But the term atheist, I think, is really a very powerful word. And it's used more by people, I think, who are really activist about their lack of belief. And you're right, there are a number of scientists who would argue that a requirement for the profession is to be an atheist. I mean, Lisa Randall has said, the cosmologist at Harvard, that she doesn't understand how one can believe in God and be a scientist at the same time. And so that's a pretty strong statement to make. And of course, it influences young people because they're very impressionable, and young people who want to go into science see adult scientists as role models. And we all well know that what scientists say, even when it goes beyond their area of expertise, their particular field of work, are believed more often than most other people in society, certainly more than politicians and maybe psychologists and so forth. Scientists have a huge amount of credibility in our society, and for that reason, a lot of what a scientist might say that is not necessarily well informed is still accepted by fans of science and others. And so, it's very tricky. It really is very tricky. I think as a scientist, I have to say we have a responsibility to not go beyond our areas of expertise, or when we do, to make it clear that we're speaking as individuals, as any individual might, who does not necessarily have a particular expertise in that. So I've sort of wandered into a different topic, I realize, but bottom line is I don't like to use the word atheist when I'm talking to my colleagues. I have been at a dinner table, where there are people I know are ardent atheists and rather anti-religious.
Mm-hmm.
When the conversation wanders into something, that might refer to something negative that maybe the Pope did or something else or some misconception, I will correct it. But I will, also be careful not to turn the dinner into a whole discussion about religion and science, because just because someone is an atheist does not mean they want to spend that whole time talking about that, for sure.
Fair enough.
There's time and a place for everything. And actually, I've had many opportunities to talk. I mean, even at Cornell, I mentioned the talk I gave in the Space Science Building. That in turn led to us a talk in the Cornell Summer Lecture Series the following summer in front of over 200 people in one of the big lecture halls. And, there were a lot of very, very good questions and, people who were thinking carefully. One student came up to me and she said she didn't have any beliefs, but she was having trouble understanding this concept of, I was talking about Thomistic creation and the difference between a beginning of something and the creation of things in the Thomistic sense. And so we had a really good conversation where we tried to wrestle with analogies that would resonate with her and, would be close enough to what St. Thomas was trying to say. And those are really the opportunities to, I think, broaden people's minds. We have now on our campus, we're a chapter of the Thomistic Institute, based in Washington, D.C., thanks, in fact, to a graduate student over in applied physics who got this going and asked me to be the faculty advisor. And we've had at least two of our talks now have had almost or just over 100 people attending. And I know that most of those people are not Catholics. And, it's, and they're thoughtful and the questions are thoughtful. And it's just an opportunity to take people out of the stereotypes that they've been subjected to about religion and faith that are all around us in the media, unfortunately, and, expose them to the really thoughtful core ideas of our faith and faith in general.
For a lot of these self-identified atheists, is it just because of their naturally scientific thinking, does their atheism stem from more a personal experience that angered them and upset them? Or is it the sense that, religion is based on mythology, and as a scientist, it's my duty not to deal in the realm of myth?
Well, I think, for different people, it's one or the other of both of those. I mean, they're both things that happen very often in, when we're young. Religious education today is something that very few people really have. Even
so
if
true.
they are brought up in a Christian home or a Jewish home, they just may not get it. And so what they understand to be their religious faith comes from a pretty tenuous set of experiences, maybe in church or synagogue, maybe with their parents. And they don't get the depth of education that's required, I think, for people to understand the relationship between that faith and what they're going to learn as they take courses in science. And so they make the mistake of trying to confront stories, for example, that come from the Bible with what they're learning in science. And so, for example, I gave a talk a year or so ago at Knights of Columbus. When the talk was over, a middle-aged woman came up to me, thanked me for the talk, said her son had lost his faith because he came to her and said, I'm taking geology now in high school, and none of this is in Genesis. It seems to be correct. I mean, he's trying to compare literally in Genesis with what he was learning in geology. His mother didn't have an answer for him, and he lost his faith. And so, and I said, well, St. Augustine went through that too, and he wrote a book called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis, and, basically started the whole tradition of trying to understand the biblical texts in their multiple meanings, their metaphorical meanings, their spiritual meanings. Georges Lemaitre, who was Catholic priest and prelate of the papal household and president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, said outright that the Bible isn't a science book, and it is there for the salvation of humankind. It's not there to teach us about the history, the physical history of the universe, and that the people who were inspired to write it were not given supernatural information about the age of the universe or other things that came to be discovered by science. And it was very clear that the Bible should not be read that way. But, how many people actually have any experience with Augustine, with Aquinas, with Lemaitre, or with any of these others? And so people are just not equipped to understand the relationship between our human experiences and our connection to God through our faith, and then what we learn from science. And so it's very natural then that people lose their faith and become atheists. So I have to say that, when I say these things, I don't have a very strong sense of optimism about it, because the answer to all of this really has to come from education at a young age. And it is just not in our society the thing to have a real education in religious ideas and where they come from.
If you enjoyed this episode or one of our previous episodes, please leave us a review on iTunes. iTunes is the biggest distributor of podcasts, and having reviews there will help us reach a wider audience. We would also love it if you posted your review on other services like Google Play and Stitcher as well.